Okay, it's 1 o'clock and we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Denisha Saucedo. I am the 2018 Regional Teacher of the Year, PSESD, and I am here with some rock stars. Luckily enough, you will not be hearing my mouth a lot in this session. It's really just going to be a conversation about action, right? And so I'm going to give a second for our panelists and my co-planner here to introduce himself in just a second. He's got a little story for you behind the title, and also we've had a Padlet going throughout the previous sessions, which was what is education for? And we had the opportunity to speak with students earlier. Their insights were amazing. And then educators, as well as Senator Claire Wilson, myself and David, we got an opportunity to kind of discuss on our end, but we brought in some true experts to really help us discuss what's the action, right? And so we have Alicia here helping us with she was there in the student panel, and then we have Senator Claire here from the teacher panel, and then we now have Brooke and Vero here, and I'll have them all introduce themselves, just to really, as the experts in the room, help us with the action. Like, what's next? What do we do? What is education for? And really, this is just going to be a conversation, right? And before we get into that nitty gritty, let's go ahead and do introductions. And then David, can you drop in the chat that Padlet? And what we'd like you to do is just, even panelists, you can take a look at what people have written from the first down to the last, right? They're all intermixed, and just kind of, you can use those as a catalyst for some of your conversations if you would like. But essentially, just kind of getting an idea of what people have been thinking throughout the day. So David, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll have our panelists introduce themselves as well.
Yeah, so before the rock stars, there's me. I'm David Beitenfeld. I'm the 2021 Regional Teacher of the Year from ESD 113 in the Capital Region.
And now, our panelists. So these again are the rock stars. So like I said, we have Alicia and we have Senator Claire visiting from the earlier two panels to help us really, they were there to kind of take it in. They're gonna take what they heard and really get into the action. And so can you two both introduce yourselves, please?
There. I guess I can go first. My name is Alicia Saucedo. You guys can call me Allie, Alicia, either is fine. And I am a senior at Thomas Jefferson High School in Federal Way School District, and I'm really excited to be here.
I'm Senator Claire Wilson, and I'm a neighbor of Denisha and Alicia because I live in the 30th and I represent the 30th Legislative District, but I'm here, I think, because of my role as Vice Chair of Early Learning K-12 in the Senate, but also because I spent 25 years at Puget Sound ESD working in early learning K-12 services across King and Pierce County, taught for 10 years in Tacoma, pregnant and parenting adolescents, and then also sat on the school board in Federal Way for 8 years. And what we're talking about is near and dear to my heart. And Alicia, you always go first because your voice matters most.
Thank you, thank you. And definitely the experts in the room, Brooke and Vero. I don't know which one of you want to go first, but if you would like to introduce yourselves, please.
Go ahead, Brooke. Go ahead, my sister. Go ahead, you go first.
We're both like, you go first, you go first. All right, my name is Brooke Brown. I'm just grateful and humbled to be here. I am a teacher at Washington High School in the Franklin Pierce School District. I've been there for 15 years. I teach English and ethnic studies, and I'm the 2021 Washington State Teacher of the Year. And I just have to say that I am so grateful and humbled to be able to learn from and with Vero. And so I'm just excited for today to be in community with y'all.
Good afternoon. I'm like, good morning, good afternoon. And these times, we don't even know what time of day it is anymore. You know, I just feel honored and humbled to be in this space. Denisha, thank you so much for inviting us to come to this space. And I by no means consider myself an expert, but I do think that what I feel so honored by is to be in beautiful community with folks like Brooke and Denisha and others, and young folks, and previously with mothers that I spent 15 years as a grassroots organizer, learning and working around school reform issues. So really, we do this, as Brooke said, in and with community in the best ways possible, or at least that's the attempt. So I consider myself sort of an aspiring scholar, an aspiring educator, someone who's constantly working and learning from other folks. But my current professional role is I am associate professor at Western Washington University in secondary education, and was the founding director for the education and social justice minor and program there, and currently working to resurrect the College of Ethnic Studies on our campus. So that is our current effort, talk about applying education toward a future we all deserve. But really, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And again, thank you so much, Denisha, for the invitation.
David, you want to kick us off with?
Yeah, so
story behind this
about the title of this session. Once upon a time, there lived a teacher who was accorded a great honor as an educator of the year, perhaps by their school or their region, maybe even their state or country. The award ceremony was a glorious recognition of their years of hard work and service, their accomplishments, and of their love and respect for their students. And the teacher lived happily ever after. Until Monday morning, when that first school bell rang and the students showed up and hated the lesson, and 3 parents emailed with problems just before the principal asked for a meeting during lunch. And the myriad pedantic distractions of daily life reemerged, threatening to eclipse that so recently felt clarity and optimism. And the teacher slowly smiled, recalling that the ecstasy never lasts. There's always the laundry. So, panelists, we want to know, we're going to come out of this conference with all this energy and these ideas and this optimism. What's next? Because tomorrow morning is coming.
And so with that, we kind of want to open up with, we've heard from so many voices today, and Vero and Brooke, we haven't, I'd like to start with the two of you with what do you think education is for, just to kind of ground us. And then around what is education for, we need to know what's next. Like, what do we do? Like, where do we go? Like, what are some action items that we can take? Like, we just want to have a conversation together. How do we do this? Are we just all going to be stuck there Monday morning going, I think I now know what education is for, but what do I do? And so that's the conversation we'd like to have today.
Go ahead, Brooke. You want to start? Okay. So I'll just share quickly. This is the $1 million question, right? One of the things I often tell my students at Western, the complexity of doing work that's critically grounded. What I mean by critical, my sister always asks me, but I'll use the word critical all the time. What do you mean by that, right? But for me, when I think about building that sort of critical anchoring in terms of applying education, and in my case, my work is really geared toward efforts around justice, really requires to kind of hold this tension between the constant sort of deepening what our literacies, our understandings of things that are really important to our lives. It's partly thinking about what's schooling, but more importantly, what education broadly can provide us, really getting a sense of what we need to know about the world, about our lives, our relationship to the world. But this idea that also we need to figure out, how are we going to change things? Like, how does our education become applied toward creating the better future that we all deserve? But we tend to oftentimes rush to those Monday morning solutions, right? We want to kind of come to like Monday morning, like have a plan, right? And I think for, my background, just to give a little bit of context too. So my training is in sort of critical race theory, ethnic studies, Chicana feminisms. I'm constantly thinking about those knowledge bases that have long been ignored in context of higher education or systems of education more broadly. But, coming from that place, I'm oftentimes having to think about, like, I know very little. Like, I have to continue to sort of constantly, even doesn't matter if I have 3 letters after my last name, I am a constant and perpetual learner in this work. And to know that I need to always sort of deepen my literacy around that. At the same time, begin to use that literacy and apply that literacy to change the world. So I think there's a tension that we have to hold, right? So on the one hand, it's like, yes, we need to think about where do we move to action? But even in that action, we have to be constantly reflecting about what we still do not yet know, and what we need to continue to be building in community to kind of engage that literacy, to engage those conversations. So when I think of the education, Denisha, you kind of framed it really powerfully. I had a beautiful mentor who would always ask me when I was, getting more degrees than I probably needed to get. And I'm always sort of have this tension around my education and all the sort of years I spent in higher ed. But one of the things he always asked me is like, for what and for whom? And I think those questions continue to shape my life and continue to shape everything I do in terms of my continual learning. But I have to wrestle with this, right? I mean, there's only so much we can reflect. We need to begin to apply. So I think for me, as I think about this, for me, it's a constant tension between those two things, the application and the constant learning. And I want to have Brooke jump in here in a second, because I have other things that I want to share, but that's sort of the initial entry into this. I think we need to hold a particular tension in the work. And I think that's really important, because when we rush to action and are not in the perpetual learning, we can also forget that there are some incredible communities, incredible scholars, incredible educators that we need to be continuing to build within this work. And that to me is really critical. So I'm gonna turn over to my sister Brooke to talk a little bit more about what she thinks in this.
Yeah, and I'll just build on what you said, Vero, and really thinking about for what and for whom. I really, I love that. And I think that drives a lot of the work that we do. So I teach 12th grade, and really thinking about just really every moment mattering in class, and every moment being really important with my students, and really thinking about school is, hold on, let me back up a little bit. Students are educated far before they even enter the schoolhouse. And so really thinking about, I love how Vero pointed out the difference between education and schooling, and really thinking about, you know, what are we trying to accomplish in our classrooms? And I think that's really the sort of the crisis point that we're at in this moment. We have a lot of really great teachers doing a lot of really great work, and sort of grappling with that question. And then again, like, it's Monday, now we got to get back to business. And so really thinking about that dissonance, thinking about that tension. And one way that I've sort of been thinking about it lately is really thinking about what defines success for my students. And so really thinking about, is it me as an educator that defines success? I heard Senator Wilson say something earlier about how we're all experts because we've been through the schooling system. But just because something worked for us doesn't mean that that's the right way or the best way or the way that's going to help our students. Something that grounds me is really thinking about making sure to understand our students need to be prepared for careers that don't even exist. And so what are we doing to really reimagine? What are we doing to help students spark creativity? What are we doing to partner with our communities, with their families, to really think about what do they believe is best? I really think that students and families, that our communities have the answers that we seek, if we would just sort of get out of the way, provide them a seat at the table, and really listen. And so I think this pandemic has really demonstrated to me what has been going on for a long time is us, sort of doing school, and kids or students that sort of know how to do school become successful. And those that don't sort of come up against barriers and come up against lack of access to opportunities in school, but also outside of school. And so what are we doing to really remove those barriers? What are we doing to learn and continue to have humility? To know that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay, but there are people in our community that do. And so what are we doing to partner with them and to really listen, and then not just listen and harvest what they have to say, but make those necessary changes? What parts of our privilege are we willing to give up? Not to just leverage our privilege, but to say, how can my humanity connect to your humanity? How can I support? And really understanding that all of our success as a whole community is really connected to one another. And if we're not collectively successful, then that's not really success.
Yeah. Brooke, I'm always like, I think we have this kind of interaction because we're the three of us are connected. Denisha and Brooke, myself, along with Jerry Price, connected through some of the OSPI work we're doing around ethnic studies. And I feel like, Brooke, every time you speak, I'm just kind of like, just taking it all in, because you hit on so many things that are so important in this work. And I think the humility component is really key. And if I may, I wanted to share just a quick story. I mentioned briefly, I was a grassroots organizer for 15 years working with migrant mothers around educational reform. And I remember this moment when I graduated from my undergrad, had that BA, I thought I could solve the world's problems in 6 months. I was energetic, I was ready, I was committed. And, I did all the things. I did all the things that I was taught in my training, right? And I did all the things that I, had learned about doing grassroots and community-based organizing. I had made enough flyers and did a phone tree to contact all the parents to come, for this one meeting one night. I made, I think, enough champurrado, which is like a Mexican hot chocolate, to like feed an army, right? I had enough pan dulce. I had childcare. I had everything on lock. I was ready to go. And I still remember one mother came to that meeting. And I had this moment of just feeling so disappointed, right? Because it's like I had done all the work. I had done everything. I had followed the lessons. And I remember she walked in and the first thing she said, she's like, Mija, she's like, what makes you think that just because you have a college degree and you're happy-go-lucky that we're going to just show up to a meeting? It's like, you don't know us. You haven't taken the time to get to know us. Get to know us and get to know how challenging our relationship has been with the school and with the school district. Get to know us first, right? Because just, and so it was one of these moments that kind of shifted my lens on the work, right? And my lens on what I needed to learn and what I needed to know. And I spent a year, and I shared with Brooke and Denisha, I'm not a morning person, but I will do it if I need to. And I remember getting up at like the crack of dawn and showing up with coffee and just waiting for the mothers to arrive to drop off their children. And I have this moment where, I started to pay attention to things that I hadn't paid attention to before. For example, the cop car parked in front of the street every day when the mothers would drop off their kids. I started to pay attention to that. The whole school was fenced in, barbed wire around the top. And I began to think if I were a mother at this school, I would feel like I'm not welcome either, right? The subtleties of the kinds of other types of discourses or the other kinds of messages that are being sent to families that we oftentimes don't pay attention because of where we're anchored in a particular project, right? I never had an opportunity to be outside of the school until this moment to see what the mothers were seeing. It took a year of doing coffees in the morning, talking with the mothers, till about a year later, a mother said to me, what are you doing after the bell rings? And and I was like, I don't know, make myself useful, figure out what I can do to support the school. And she said, I want to invite you to my home. It's about 3 blocks away. So I walked with her. And when I walked into her home, there were about 60 parents in her home. And she said to me, she's like, just because we're not organizing at the school site doesn't mean that we're not organizing. And it was this moment that again, that shift, I was looking in the wrong places, that my training hadn't prepared me for this. And so I think what Brooke is saying too, I think really illuminating the importance of humility in this work, the sort of the constant commitment to learn. So even as we think about applying action, we need to know that that's always an iterative reflection in terms of our learning as well. And so I say that really humbly because it changed my life, that moment when I realized that the lessons that I had learned in college had not prepared me to experience what I experienced, right? And to actually apply that knowledge to actually support their work. Those are some of my initial thoughts.
And thank you for sharing that. And something that I think is really important just to add to that is we have to trust folks when they share their story, when they're willing to share, right, their stories, where they're at, their pain. We can't just sit and ask them to do that and then leave. And really developing that trust. Something that Vero shared with me that I always think about is how community is a verb. It's something that's built, and it's something that's built over time, and it's something that has to be continuously revisited and continuously built. And so it's not a one parent night where we ask. It's not a survey being sent home. I mean, it's the same in our classrooms. It's not a 1 through 5 check-in and then get to content. And something I miss so much about being in the classroom, I missed it when we were remote, is like just those conversations in the hallway. I missed the few minutes after the bell when we could just chill and we could talk about what was happening. And I missed being engaged in my students' life in that way. But I also would add that in the school day, really thinking about, there's a big push for social emotional learning and thinking about that action, but really making sure that the social emotional learning has an anti-racist orientation, has a trauma-informed lens. So we're not asking students who have had to deal with trauma, have had to deal with racism, to then be triggered in a lesson that is supposed to be helping them. And so really making sure that we're taking the time to learn about the community we work and we serve. Again, not just to harvest their stories, but to build intentional relationships. And those relationships are not transactional. They are deeply intentional. They're reciprocal. And it's not based on what I can give or what I can get, it's what I can give. And so I think when we start to really think about relationships in that sense, then that starts to shift the way that we approach the work.
Yes. When I hear you both speak, and when I hear Ali from earlier and our senator from earlier, I hear slow down. If I want to take one word from that, I hear slow down. I hear relationships. I hear so much. And so how can we filter this down just a little bit so that those that are educators that are listening, leadership, admin that are listening, speak to them a little bit about their specific, because you're right, that like people want I want a lesson plan, I want to do this, and then we make a mistake, right? Brooke, same thing, we jump into that SEL lesson without truly slowing down and thinking about who's in the room. And so let's speak to them a little bit more about what this action really looks like. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Is that okay, Vero? I'll hop in real quick. I think that the most important work to start with is the individual work. It's the work to really start to think about who you are, where you come from. We live in a racialized society. I heard our Dean of Students last year was in my classroom speaking to my ethnic studies students, and he challenged them to think about, you look on a map, there's no country called white. There's no country called Black. So how did we arrive to where we are? And so much of the work with ethnic studies and really just a humanizing pedagogy is really starting to think about how do we connect to our place of origin, to our space and place. And for some of us, it's about celebrating. And for some of us, it's about reconnecting. It's about figuring it out. It's about finding out and realizing the how and why. It's historicizing the present moment and to really understand your positionality and really thinking about in our school, in whatever community that we work in, we may not live in that community. And so what does that look like to come in and to serve in that community? And even if we do, we may not have the same experiences as the folks that we are serving in our community. So making sure that we have the humility to really understand how we present ourselves in situations. And so it really looks like really thinking about yourself, getting to know yourself in my classroom, and I'll talk about this later, but really about this idea of what does critical self-love look like? What does it look like to really get to know yourself and really understand your own core values and how you see the world so that you can develop empathy, so that then that can result in solidarity. Empathy and compassion is necessary, but solidarity is really what we want to accomplish. And so Vero helped me out with that, because I was always thinking empathy and compassion, but solidarity is really what we need, and really thinking about how can we show up and serve one another. It starts with really understanding ourselves and then being able to step aside and trust those folks, especially our BIPOC voices, to be able to show up and to lead and to trust their experiences.
No, absolutely, Brooke. I mean, I think for me where it goes to, and I think to your point too, also Denisha, is this notion of our theories of change. And I'm always having to ask myself, as an educator, as someone that's deeply committed to figuring out how do we shift the terrain in our public schooling? How do we build better with our families, particularly those that have been historically excluded from particular conversations? How do we engage that? I think we have to ask ourselves really deeply, even in our learning, what is our theory of change? So, and that's I learned that, how do we shift from empathy to solidarity from the mothers? And again, I always go back to that training where it was literally education and action those 15 years is where I got to see probably the most powerful examples of that come to fruition. And they taught me this because I had a moment probably halfway through my organizing years where it was kind of a bit of an existential crisis, right? So I was in my doctoral program and learning all these beautiful things about critical theory and about how to, how can we engage in a different kind of relationship to, particularly to our communities of color, to the undocumented, to the first generation, right? How do we think about our work really deeply immersed in some of those projects? And I just had a moment where I was working with the mothers and I'm like, I am a child of immigrant parents. My mother's from Mexico, my father's from Panama. I was born in the US though. So I don't understand, my reality isn't one that is organized around not having a social security number. Like I don't organize where I shop, where I drop off my kids, the points I avoid. That's a point of privilege for me, right? I also, someone that doesn't, while I have many, many nieces and nephews and a lot of children who I love, I don't have my own children. So the complexities of what it meant to be an organization of mothers, working for reform, what was my role? And I remember one of the moms grabbed me by the shoulders and she's like, stop it. Because I just had this, I'm like, what am I doing here? What is my relationship to this work? How do I apply all the things I've learned? And she's like, we need you to always be a little bit uncomfortable because it keeps you reflecting on your positionality and your relationship to the work, but we need you to move. And she said to me something really important. It's like, you may never know what it's like to walk her shoes, but that's not the point. There is a role you play in working in solidarity with us. And that's where I need you to sort of shift your understanding of your theory of change. If your theory of change is to walk in her shoes, then you've missed the point, right? And so she helped me to begin, and these were the kinds of questions that they constantly threw my way, right? Constantly shifting me to ask, is it diversity we seek or justice? Is it so? I mean, so they would constantly sort of flip the terrain. And I think those are the kinds of questions we have to, we engage in deeply in community. I kept, thinking about, I was thinking so early on in sort of my own organizing work. And, I was reflecting just now on how, my theories of change have shifted so much over time to understand that when I think about education for action, the only way that it shifted is because I did it in community, because they were in relationship to young folks, to these mothers who were asking me really deeply, like, how do I understand that change happens? And what is the role of education in that project? And so, I also come, also from my own training, I draw a lot on Paulo Freire. Those who may not are familiar with Paulo Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, highly recommended if people haven't read it. But I saw it in action with this group. And it was this idea, is like, how do we become, this idea of becoming literate, not just literate in the word, but literate in the world. And that our literacy has to constantly be in conversation with those two things. How do we read the world? How do we understand our relationship as educators, as students of the world, right? And so, these are the kinds of things that for me, I always come back to those touch points. And the mothers were so good because they would always give it to me plain. This wasn't a theoretical lecture from my doctoral program. This was like, Vero, we're going to tell you straight, right? Like, here's how we have to understand. And even things like, for example, when I first met them, and I really wanted to partner with them and figure out a way I can support their work, one of the moms told me, she's like, Vero, are you a baseball player? And I was like, that's an odd question to ask. I'm not sure. And I don't want to get the wrong answer because then they're not going to let me. So I had all these things, right? And she kind of smiled. And after she asked me that question, she said, the reason I ask is I want to know if you're going to step and run. Because a lot of folks want to come to our communities, but then they just step and run. So let me ask you again, are you a baseball player? And I was like, no, I'm not a baseball player. But just the way that they would lay it out for you, right? And I think those are the kinds of questions. I think for me, when I think of action, it's less about coming to answers and it's more about asking a different set of questions. Because I will always keep us reflecting and moving in a particular way, right? And keep us deepening our literacies about the world, not just the word. So those are my responses. And I believe, Senator Wilson, you unmuted a little while ago, and I want to make sure you jump in, but I wanted to give some spot because I'm like, this is what Brooke and I, we've done our, let's just keep going. Like,
I just can't even tell you, in 1991, I started as a parent involvement coordinator in my work at Puget Sound ESD. But before that, again, I'd been in rural Montana with Hmong and Laotian refugees that had just come over after the Vietnam War, who were not welcome in that community. And I didn't come from education knowing I was going to be in education. I got my master's degree because somebody offered me a scholarship, which is my whole other, nobody ever told me I was good at anything. So I just did what somebody offered me. But I ended up, working with young women and then in early learning. And we forget that children come in the context of families, which is exactly what you're talking about. And with the institutions of education, there are brick and mortar buildings that individuals have to come through in order to feel like they're part of a community. And in early learning, there is no brick and mortar. You know, you come into a community, you look around, you create programs based on the needs of families, but children don't just show up. And so what my experience has been over the last 40 years has been that families then suddenly, they never walk across those K-12 doors oftentimes because there's no place for them. And I have families that I've worked with in the last 35 years whose kids used to be 4 and they're not 4 anymore. You know, they're in their 30s and they're in their 50s and they have kids now. But, you know, they're born leaders. They're the Somali Parent Education Board. They're the South King County Discipline Coalition. They're the Washington State Parent Ambassadors. All of these are individual and powerful, powerful folks who had no space or place and didn't find you in K-12, you know? And so it is about, for me, understanding I walk with privilege and getting out of the way. And not expecting one to take on any structure that I've created, but providing the open door for folks to create their own structure. And I guess the only, you know, other thing that I would say is that anything that happens from a legislative level happens from the outside. So all the conversations and all the ideas and all the legislation comes from individuals just like you, just like the families we're talking about. So as we talk about action, I would love to offer up the conversation to talk about what would it look like and what is needed in order for folks like all of us and like all of you who are touching young people every single day. And Alicia, I say that to you as well. What do we need to continue to do and what do we need to stop doing in order to make the system the way we know it should be? I just, the for what and for whom is always the question. And anytime we think of something, it's like, who is at the center of what we're talking about and the intent and the impact of what we do there. So I just am in such humbleness and such thanks for all that you are doing and the rich conversations, and just know that disequilibrium is what brings us to equilibrium, but we'll never get there and we shouldn't. Because I think as you talk about the tension, that's what keeps us moving forward. So just my heart is very warm and I'm here to support it any way I can to bring the resource and the support that's needed to keep the changes moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think about what you say, and I think about power keeps coming up throughout the each and every session. And so I'd like to give Ali a chance to kind of think about that power and think about what you've heard us say here about action and what we think should be next. What do you think should be next?
Yeah, so I actually wrote down something about power and like the whole hierarchy. I feel like that's in education that seems so daunting to students because we see like, oh, we have district employees or we have legislators or principals or teachers, and their opinions are sometimes given to us as objective. And so it's hard to move forward in an equitable lens when we're given this one like perspective or this one idea. And so I think that's part of what has to start is approaching as like a teacher or as someone that it's a relationship and it's a two-way street. And I think leveling, I've talked about that before today, but leveling that playing field and saying, I want to learn about you, because education is ultimately a service. That's what it is. It's other people trying to give to students and to people and to give them what they need to be successful. And so when you're giving someone a service, it's not what you need or what you think should be done. It's what they need, what they think, and their ideas and perspectives are arguably more important than your own. And so that was actually something I wrote down, and being able to be vulnerable with them to say, I don't understand, and that's okay that I don't understand, and I'll never understand, but I want to get to know you and I want to provide for you. Some other little points I wrote down. I know we spoke a little bit about like the SEL and that sort of aspect of school, and I feel like it's always spoken about as like a separate entity. it's like, oh, we need to now focus on this part, and it's like 30 minutes to do this, and it's like we check the box. But I feel like this is almost the exact reverse of what needs to happen, because making us better people and giving us the tools to build relationships and be like socially well, and like your equitable, I can't think of the word, but just like, yeah, your social well-being is arguably more important than learning about an event that happened 200 years ago, or learning your math facts, because while everything is applicable, if you're not okay as a person, then it arguably doesn't matter what's beyond that. And so I think going back to those pieces of the puzzle that are so important, that I think are overlooked, and saying that the little things are oftentimes the most substantial things. And sorry, I'm trying to make sure I get everything. The last thing I wanted to say was that the answers to all these like really pressing questions, they aren't in a book. They aren't in like a piece of legislation somewhere. I think it's in our hearts, and it's changing what we perceive the world to be, is like honestly where it needs to start.
Dang, Allie. I was like, yes, 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 yes. I mean, all the things that you're saying are just so powerful. I mean, this is, and so appreciative of what you brought so many things to my mind right now. And but first I want to just, honor your voice in this, and also thinking about how do we understand and how do we build really critically in these spaces with youth voices. And I think you have so much to offer in helping us to think and ask different kinds of questions. And one of the things that immediately comes to mind as I'm hearing you is that, oftentimes we enter the work around action to solve a problem, rather than how do we enter action to amplify joy. And I say that because even in our work around ethnic studies, we're thinking about this because so much of our analysis is around power. But really, at the end of the day, when we think about working toward justice, it's really about working toward joy and happiness, right? There's a lot of stuff in between that keeps us from being fully well, fully joyful, fully, again, to embrace our full humanity in the work. So when I think about this, what would it mean to enter action with the spirit of wanting to amplify joy, versus trying to fix a problem, even though we know that inherently these are structural things and we're trying to remedy particular issues. But what if, again, I think this goes back to the notion of theory of change, right? Because I always say, oftentimes, even in the work of ethnic studies, I often have to remind colleagues, like, we're more than just the oppressed, right? Like, like that is oftentimes the way we're pegged, because people are trying to think about historical injustices and historical inequities, and all that analysis is important. But I also talk about, like, I don't go home to my family and be like, Vero the Chicana, the first gen has arrived. Like, they'll be like, what? You're just Vero to us. Like, why would you? But I feel like you're constantly positioning yourself in relationship to institutions and relationship to projects. But when we go home, we just are, right? And so I think about the ways in which how we enter can be different. And how do we think about the ways in which, I'm hearing you, Allie, like, amplify what makes you joyful, what makes you happy? And how do we think about our theories of change from that place? And then I couldn't help but think about, also the work of a dear colleague of mine, Philip Stevens. He's a colleague out of the University of Idaho, and he does this beautiful work around Apache mathematics and preparing math teachers. And he shares a story. He opens up his work and he talks about the importance of making wood, and he talks about Apache youth on the reservation in San Carlos in Arizona, right? And he says, if you know anything about what Apache youth do in the summer, they go out and cut mesquite. And they, if you know anything about mesquite's a really twisty, windy wood. And they have to figure out how to load the bed of a truck in a particular way to maximize, right, the space, and also maximize the number of trips, or minimize the number of trips back and forth. He's like, Apache youth from a very young age begin to learn on an Euclidean three-plane tessellation model of the world, mathematical model of the world, which is way more sophisticated than the two-plane Euclidean tessellation model that we teach in our current public schools, right? So he talks about Apache youth being mathematical geniuses, but the moment they enter school, they're being taught math in a way that doesn't align to their ways of being and knowing. So they become to see themselves as being bad at math when they're actually geniuses in their own right. So I share this example because even at the very core, even in subjects that we don't often think about, where we can enact really beautiful change and where power is working, like a math class where we think it's just facts, it's actually not just facts, right? There are young folks who are learning math in a very different way, and yet we're not preparing teachers to think about. So it's one thing to think about, okay, I want to think about providing, youth of color access to math, but then we're only providing access to math in a way that actually still doesn't reflect their ways of being and knowing. So I say this because what are we willing to do as educators to really at the core of the core shift our terrain in our classrooms and in the ways that we engage. How deep are we willing to get to know youth versus just seeing them as those that don't have access or those that have been lacking, when really what's been lacking has been the ways that we have approached how we structure school, how we structure curriculum, how we structure lesson plans. So Ali, you brought so much to my fore right now as I think about, you know, your connection to these other movements that are trying to shift at the very core of things, how we act to shift toward a more just future. So thank you, Ali.
So I want to like center myself around, you know, the student voice that we heard earlier and the voices that I'm hearing right now. And I wonder if you could leave, if those that are listening could leave here with a thought or not, I don't even want to use the word action anymore because it just seems so like so simplistic, but with what is my role? Kind of what can I look at or think about or process, or how do I think about me in this space? What kind of advice would you give those that are listening? And let's talk to everyone, right? Ali, you can talk to the students or even to your teachers. Senator, you can also, you know, talk to anyone. Brooke, Vero, anyone. I just kind of want to know, like, if we're talking to them personally, like how do we get them to see that we all have a role in this? Because I heard it. I heard that, like, community, solidarity, like together. And that's huge. And so how can we, let's speak to each of them. Anyone can go first.
I'm looking at my sister Brooke, but I'm like trying to figure out, because I think Brooke, you can probably speak more. Well, I mean, folks here can all speak more to the educator, right? To you know, I definitely will speak more to those in the academy, right? Who are oftentimes talking a lot about school and a lot about community without community and without school agents. And we're theorizing, putting forth research, but don't get me wrong, a lot of it is really great, but I'm just, you know, I am lovingly putting out there for my academic colleagues to think really deeply about the work that they do, especially if they're working in the context of education, how they're actually bringing in those voices into the work that they do much more intentionally. You know, I think the word we're looking for, Denisha, is praxis. And I find praxis to be a much better fit here because praxis centers this, it's the ongoing iterative reflection between action and learning. You know, that in our actions, we hope that generates new questions, that brings us back to a constant place of learning. And praxis for me, because it comes specifically from that work that Paulo Freire did, it's always in community, right? So it's a center that we don't know everything. We know a lot of, you know, we know some things about some things, but we don't know everything about everything. And so how do we sort of continuously remind ourselves that we have a lot to learn from others in our spaces? So I say that really humbly, that maybe praxis is what should be helping us move forward, right? A sort of that ongoing commitment, that ongoing reflection. You know, that reflecting just for the sake of reflecting doesn't move us, and acting for the sake of acting doesn't keep us sort of committed to those deeper questions of theories of change. But that's where I would speak to some of my academic colleagues lovingly, right? Who have a lot of heart and a lot of passion, but we get isolated a lot of times into our worlds, into the academy. And I would just speak to those of you who are doing family work and partnership work. I really want to connect with you all because that work is near and dear to my heart. And I think that work goes hand in hand in sort of supporting what educators and young folks are doing every day in the classroom. But I think we need to think really, really differently about those relationships. Again, we're still wanting to get families to, even in the best sort of ways that we frame policy, to adapt to a school context, rather than, you know, thinking that our school context is actually framed really deeply by our relationships with our families, and how can that help us lead differently moving forward in terms of the work we do. So that's a couple comments that I would say specifically about to respond to your question, Denisha.
Yeah, and just to add to that beautiful comment, is just to really think about how can it be sustainable? I think sort of speaking to Vero's comment earlier about being a baseball player, you know, there's a lot of interest in the work after the murder of George Floyd and the moment that we're in. And so I think really we need sustained work, we need sustained effort, and that looks like more than reading. That looks like, but that's a place to start. That looks like more than what we're watching or listening to, but that's a place to start. And so what I would say is embrace it's like a 400, right? So I speak in sports metaphors. So Allie, I know you're a runner. I'm not sure what event, but the 400 is a race, y'all. So like, that's like it's not a sprint, but it kind of is, but it's not long distance, but it kind of is. Like, yo, I ran the 400 one time and I was gassed after like 150. Like, it took everything in me not to have a seat on the track. I was a thrower. So, but I ran cross country. And so part of what we need to really acknowledge and understand is what our position is and what sphere of influence that we can have where we're at. Everyone can have influence. Everyone can change the climate or the weather around them based on the choices that they make and the opportunities and the folks that they serve. But really understanding what is the ask. And so if we don't know what we're being asked to do, you'll be running a 100 in a 400 event. That's rough. And so really thinking about, you know, leaning on the wisdom of other folks, but also leaning into being uncomfortable, leaning into knowing that if it feels good and you feel like you're ready, you're too late. And so what does that look like to really embrace that tension, to lean into that praxis in a way that you're learning and applying, and get yourself a squad. Part of this work is that it has to be done in community. And one of I think some of the most beautiful community work is intergenerational. We need the young folks because they help us to understand what's happening. They need folks that are, you know, a little bit older and folks that I think I'm like in the middle. I still like the side part, yo. And so, you know, I'm not at the younger generation, but I have other folks that I can learn from as well. And so really thinking about that's how I think we can really move forward together, is learning from one another, never having, like, I love how you said, I don't know everything about everything. I'm always an aspiring anti-racist ethnic studies teacher. I'm always aspiring to serve my students better. And that takes work, but it has to be done with joy as well. So you got to get a squad, you got to be pursuing joy, and you really have to be able to imagine something better. And so having the vision, staying connected to your creativity, to what fills you up as well, because understanding your positionality for BIPOC folks, sometimes that means we need to rest. Sometimes that means saying no. Sometimes that means stepping back and letting folks Google some stuff, right? And really attending to your own well-being. And so really thinking deeply about what you can do to continue in the journey, because we can't be baseball players. I mean, I love baseball, don't get me wrong, but we can't run. We need to stay here. We need to run and continue the journey.
Wow. It is a long journey. And for some, it's, you know, I have people that say to me, well, you know, if you've been on it for so long, why haven't you fixed it? Because one person can't, you know, and each one reach one. And that's how change happens. And, but it's taken way too long. And we're the only place in this world where, as I said earlier, you got to do the wrong thing to get what you need to do it right. It should never be that way. And if we didn't have inequities that have lasted so and been there forever, we wouldn't be where we are today. And so we have so much that we need to make up for, and so much work that we need to do. And there's so many folks that don't understand issues of anti-racism and privilege. And that's probably for me the hardest thing inside an institution, is helping people get out of the way, but also understand the world they've lived in so very long that they have no idea. And Brooke, you know, when I said earlier that all people had gone to school, I said that tongue in cheek. And I say that because every time we tried to change something that would be better for scholars or better for systems or better for our communities of color, we would have individuals that would say, in closed doors or in open doors, you know, well, I never needed that, or that was, I went to school, and then when I went to school, that wasn't what, and this is not when you went to school. And so, and now my dog is agreeing with me as someone walks by. So, you know, what I can do is continue to push the system. And I also can continue to be who I am in every room, and identify myself as a lesbian woman, which I do. And I do that so that young people know that there's a place and a space, for I didn't know that. I never saw myself. I never heard of myself. And that is the experience of so many scholars. I also think what I can do is make sure that we don't put barriers in the way of creating what we know young people need and want, and that is access to individuals who look like them, who have life experiences, and have an opportunity to make connections that we know are also critically important. You know, making sure that the lens I have and the work I do continues to be focused on, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, that I don't think I know, but I seek those that do know. And that's what I continue to value, is the voice of others. And the door is always open, and for each and every one of you and for anyone else. I guess the only other thing I would say is I've never been in politics before, which is probably a good thing. What I also know is there are many people who don't necessarily feel they have someone who does represent them or understands. And for me, I am a voice for those folks as well. For one does not need to live in one's area in order to make sure that their voice is heard. So I just put out there that every change comes from individuals who think that there's a systems problem or an issue or something that's not working. It doesn't come from the inside. And everything that I've done is tried to open that door. So I will continue to do that. And I would love to continue conversations with each and every one of you to make the changes we need to make. This has been so valuable. And I'm, again, so appreciative for all you do for students and families across the state. Honored.
Okay, I can go. My sort of advice, I guess, is centered towards, I feel like teachers, but I feel like this applies to all educators in a way. And it seems really simple, I guess, in my mind, but I think we get so boggled down in like the details, and this work that we're all doing here, it seems so daunting. And it's like, there's so much to do, and there's just this long road ahead of us. But I think it starts with like the most little, small, simple thing, and that will snowball into like something better, I guess, if I'm saying this correctly. And so my advice would just be to reach out to a student, reach out to someone who maybe has like a different perspective, and to truly mean what you're asking. To how are you doing? What can I do for you? Is there anything I can do? And to mean it, and to do what they're asking, to value that perspective and to do something about it. It can just be super small. And I think that basis of a relationship that you can build with someone, for me, I'm thinking more of like my teachers doing that means the world. And that I think can build a partnership to where you can learn so much about someone who isn't like you, or maybe you learn that they are like you. And I just think that will snowball into like a bigger and better effect. Because I think as educators, you guys or people have been given a platform, and they've been given power, and it's just asking like, what are you going to do with that power? So yeah, that's what I would do.
So we just have very little time left. We have 6 minutes, and I think we've unpacked so much. And I just want after such a long day of hearing such great words of wisdom, I would just like each of you to fill this space with what else can I, what else? What else is out there? What else, what can I leave you with, right? What, if you want to, you know, give your favorite quote or leave anyone in this, who's in this space with your final thought, what would that be? Final thought, I know, it's a big one. I told myself I wasn't going to take up any space, but I am going to take up 30 seconds really quickly while you guys are thinking to say, I'm just honored and humbled because I'm leaving this space going, slow down, action is important, take the little things, it's community, listen, like everything that I learned in this space just makes me go, okay, tomorrow is another day. Tomorrow is another day and I can do this.
I think one thing sorry, Vero, did you want to go first? Okay, one thing I just wanted to share is there's this big idea of teachers as superheroes, educators as needing to tuck their capes in when they leave for work. And I just really want to push back on that, in that, you know, we're not there to save folks. But we're also not here to be martyrs. We're here in the middle to be awesome and to do the work. And so I just think, you know, a big piece of how we can sustain the work is how can you be well? How can you continue to sustain it, to sustain the work? And part of that is sustaining your expectations and really thinking about talking to students at the end of the school year last year in the spring, because I teach 12th grade. So, you know, they were graduating at the beginning of the pandemic, right after the murder of George Floyd. And so many of my students said, you know, they were sort of angry, like, why do we have to change the world? Why do we have to do everything? And my message to them actually came from acknowledgements from Stamp. So like at Jason Reynolds, thank you for the words when I didn't have them. But really, it's this idea of we cannot be spectators. We cannot just be folks that are cheering and saying, good job. It's how can we take that action? And that action are small, incremental, sustained. Just like Ali was saying, it snowballs into larger impact. And so what does that look like to show up and serve your community? And I was, when we all pivoted and started teaching remotely, I think of a lesson I spent hours preparing and one student showed up. You know, I had an opportunity to be really frustrated, or I had an opportunity to say, you know what, for that student, the world was changed because she never looked at that instance the same way. But I also didn't give up that walk with my family that night. I also made sure to take care and spent time with my family. And so really making sure that we're attending to all the different pieces of our life so that we can model for our students what it looks like to be well, what it looks like to have joy, and what it looks like to continuously be engaged in critical praxis, that they can have all of those things too.
Yeah, Brooke just said it, yo. Like, I mean, just that, I mean, it's mic drop. I'll just share a quick quote from the mothers that I thought I would end with. I mean, I read all kinds of different folks, but I always come back to the mothers who I think of them as my teachers, who are organic intellectuals in their own right. And I just wanted to share this quote. And again, thinking about that, part of what they left me with is that you can't just come in with a blueprint for how you think change is going to be made. It's got to always be done in these sort of connections, building with folks in those spaces. And so this was the quote. Now she has it in Spanish, but I'm going to read you the translation. And it says, hope surges. This is as we were working on a campaign there in our district around housing reform, because again, a lot of the families were being priced out of that district. And so that was part of their effort. And this is what she ended with. She said, hope surges from movements that are the result of our memory and experiences. They unify our individual responsibility with our goals for social change. But hope doesn't just materialize from thin air. It needs to be fed, developed, debated, examined, and acted upon so that it becomes something real. that can only be done in community. And that takes time, but it's always worth the struggle. I'll leave you with that.
It's 1:59, and I want Senator or Ally, if either of you.
Ally, go. Ally, go.
I cannot top that. No, I'm just kidding. That was an amazing place to end. I don't know. I think we've said everything here, just to start with relationships and start with people. In my class right now, we're talking about qualia and the explanatory gap, things that we feel that we simply cannot explain, but we're not going to stop learning, and we're not going to stop trying and stop investigating. And I just look at even the C-STEP logo. It says strengthening teaching one step at a time. This is like a marathon, and we're just going to take one step at a time. So thank you.
I just want to say, you find where your passion and your purpose meet, and it's the sweet spot. And if you could figure that out, that's where change happens. And so wherever that is for anyone, that's a place I think that I always try to look for. And then, your silence breeds consent. So saying nothing changes nothing, and your silence says everything's okay, and it's not. So use your voices, and use your voices loudly. And the last thing I'll say is I have Mabel, my mentee, who I've been meeting with every Wednesday since 8th grade, and she grounds me because she's an old soul who will tell you like it is. And throughout the pandemic, and even before, I have kids of my own, but I think, Alicia, what you said is so important, that just reach out and talk to one person and really ask, and especially a young person, how are they and how can you help? Because it will change their world. It'll change your world as well.
Thank you guys so much for sharing this last hour with us. I feel like, I was filled with the students, and then I was overflowing with the teachers, and now I'm just bursting. So this is just crazy, right? And so, we will see you all back. Let's see, 2:15 is Choose Your Own Adventure. Brooke, keynote at 3:30. So yes, absolutely. All right. Thank you guys all for coming. That was amazing.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the session now, guys.
Yes.
I'll see you at the next one.
Yes.